Alright, so we're going to take a look at creating a caricature. We got Jeremy Renner here, and we're going to take some of the facial features and the important visual markers and exaggerate them for emphasis. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hit my lasso tool. There we are. Wasn't coming up right away. I'm going to grab this triangle of facial features. Alright, just kind of draw a rough outline here, and I'm going to layer via copy. Alright, so that puts a copy of his face over his face, and what we have is that guy there. Alright, so we can turn that off, and what we're going to do now is come down here, and in this area I'm going to get rid of, I'm going to get rid of the eyes and the nose and the mouth for the most part. I'm just going to try to save some of the skin around there to make it a little easier to splice in once I'm done here. Alright. Color, we're going to take that for a color, and I'm just going to dump that just like that. Alright, so I'm just going to fill it with that color there. Deselect. And now I'm going to take and copy some of this down so that we get sort of an even skin tone underneath everything else. Alright, so we get this kind of thing happening. And I'm just going to use this as a pattern. Even though there's wrinkles in the forehead, it doesn't really matter. I'm just trying to get overall this sort of skin tone fleshed out. Flesh. Get that all the way through here. So, once we get this all set, it's going to look really weird, but it'll make the next part a little bit easier. I'm going to take this stamp tool, the clone stamp, and kind of fill in these edges here. And we're going to go a little higher opacity than that. Just in that area. And this will kind of give a more even tone to the entire face, and that's absolutely what we're looking for. I'm actually going to collapse that down, Command E to select that all down there. And we'll just keep coming down on the side here. Okay, so I know this is kind of ugly, but we need it to kind of work with the rest of it. Now we're going to throw his face back on there. Looks a little bit strange, but it's still him, right? What I'm going to do now is Command T to bring up Free Transform tool, and I'm holding down the Shift key as I'm moving this around, okay? And I'm actually holding down Shift and Alt so it scales from the center. Alright, he's got kind of a big forehead, so I'm going to emphasize that in my caricature. I'm going to move that a little bit sideways there. And you can see in the navigator up here that that result, you can get kind of that thumbnail view, which is really useful. So I'm just going to move this a little bit and see what I come up with. I think that'll work. I want to kind of emphasize how his nose and his mouth and his chin kind of smash together. Chuck Jones said, every time you make a caricature, you lose a friend. And I'm not friends with Jeremy Renner, but I probably wouldn't be after this. Okay. Now, he's also got kind of a large nose by comparison to the rest of his body. So what I'm going to do is grab the nose and sort of those creases, layer via copy, and then I'm going to scale that up. Alright, and as long as I'm maintaining this triangle, it's still going to be recognizable as him, as you can see from the preview here. Okay, now I'm going to collapse this back down into the same layer because I don't need to have a bunch of layers, I just want to have one. And what I can do now is kind of go in and get that seam working. I'll use the clone stamp tool and kind of soften this a bit. Okay, so anywhere there's a hard edge, I can kind of get rid of that. so that it all appears to be part of the same thing. Now it's looking kind of goofy and funny, and that's the point. All right, I'm going to double click and unlock this layer. I needed it that way for the content, or for the I guess not content aware fill, but I needed that for a couple other things. Now I can get rid of it, and I'm also going to feather this in here. This gets to be a lot of fun if you can start to pick up on facial features. You have to observe very closely and then know what you're going to emphasize, especially for this next part, because it starts to happen pretty quickly. Alright, so most caricatures have sort of an overall shape to the head or to the body, and what I'm going to do is, I've already emphasized this forehead, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this layer here, okay, and I'm going to go to image, or sorry, edit, and I'm going to go to puppet warp. Okay, puppet warp throws a mesh over everything, and so I'm going to hit some markers. You got to put in anchors here, otherwise everything is going to move on you, and I don't want that. I'm going to put some anchors here, and I'll put some anchors here, because we're going to try to slim him out a little bit, and then kind of go from there. All right, now we get to have some fun. I'm going to give it kind of, because his hair is kind of going screen right to screen left, I'm going to give his whole body that, or his whole head, that kind of direction. I can't see this in the preview, or can I? Yeah, a little bit. So you can look in your navigator, and that'll give you a little sense of it. I'm actually going to throw another pin in here and push this back a little bit. Okay, and so that's going to punch his cheek out a little bit. Alright, so it can be a lot of fun to mess around with this stuff. I'm going to pull this in quite a bit here. Starting to look like Mark Wahlberg if I do that. I think you get an undo or two here, so that's useful as well. But again, you're just looking for little things you can do to change the overall shape without getting too crazy. And because I've maintained, like I said, if I've maintained the facial triangle in there, then everything else tends to fall in place. I'm going to throw a couple more down here. Really scrunch this together. He always has these really skinny ties and skinny suits, so I'm going to emphasize that as well. And I'll probably crop in a little bit closer as well, but not yet. I'm starting to wonder if his head would look better this way. I think that actually does it. I don't want to have the direction going too much this way, or it's too Mark Wahlberg. We got to keep it kind of big on top. Okay, so there we go. Give it a little time to think. And I can do the same thing. I'm actually going to duplicate. Because this is such a big move, I'm going to duplicate the layer. I'm going to turn this one off here, and I'm just going to edit on this one. So I'm going to go to Edit, Puppet Warp, and I'm going to get in a little bit closer here before I do this. Edit. For bigger moves, use Puppet Warp, and then for smaller moves, we're going to use something else. Alright, so I'm going to put a couple anchors in for his eyebrows, and I just want his eyebrows to be a little bit more severe, because that's another one of those things. And also, we're going to anchor the actual eye openings in, so nothing gets too distorted. There we go. And that'll also allow me to do this here. And that actually I'm going to skip. I'll just do this for the eyebrows. Again, it's trial and error. You gotta play with it. There's the eyebrows there. See the difference? Now, the last thing I'm going to do before I use this as a reference layer, image, we're going to go to filter. And this is one of my favorite ones. It's a little bit memory intensive. It's called liquify. Alright, so here we go. We can zoom in on this thing and start pushing stuff around. This is just a normal brush. You can size it like a normal brush using the caret keys. And so I'm just going to emphasize. That's a little bit, it's not quite enough. I want to push something, but I want more to move. It's not really quite behaving the way I want it to. All I want is to get the impression across that his eyes are just squinted and really only half open. So I need to go where the squint is naturally happening right now and just exaggerate it. I can actually probably bring this down as well. I could do this with Puppet Warp. It just gets a little more exacting. There you can see the difference, and so that looks pretty good. Alright, so there's Jeremy Renner as a caricatured reference. So now I've got my own reference that I'm working from, and I can continue on from here. Alright, so this is going to be part 2 of creating a celebrity caricature. What I'm doing in this episode is going to be to take what I used with what I created with my photo reference and create a line drawing from it. The point is not necessarily to trace, but also to find some edges as we go along. So as I've got it all set up here, I've got my reference layer. I'm going to lock that so I don't draw on it by accident. And I've got a background layer, and I'm just going to label that one BG for background. And this one's going to be line art. And this is the one I'm going to be working on. I'm going to lock my background, lock my reference layer, and I'm going to be working on line art. I'm just using a brush tool, a little bit larger probably. And what I want to be doing is I want to be working at, because this is a photograph and it's only 1,000 pixels tall, I'm going to go to image and image size. And I'm going to change this to a 300 pixel per inch image, and I'm going to create the overall width is going to be 14 inches wide, right? And so that gives me a pretty large pixel dimension. Okay, so this is going to be the basis for my final drawing. I was working really rough and really small with the original, but now I'm a little bit more concerned, a little bit more interested in getting up to that final size. Alright, so brush, I'm going to go at probably, let's take a look here. It's only a little bit slower than I want it to be. Part of it is the screen capture is actually slowing me down a little bit, so my performance is going to be a little bit slow compared to what I would normally tolerate if I was working. So I'd want to turn off all the other programs while I'm working on this, depending on what kind of machine you have. Alright, so I'm working on the line art, and I can even knock this back just a little bit if I want to get a little bit. There we go. Alright, and so I'm not just tracing this, I'm finding places where I can exaggerate as well. Alright, and so I'm going to start right in trying to get, and actually it's going to be better off if I'm able to control my opacity. So my brushes, I'm going to set my brush to 40% opacity instead of 100 like I had before, and that'll allow me to build up some of these things instead of just having to go with whatever is given to me on the first go round. Alright, so finding edges, that's my main goal in this part of the tutorial, is to find these planes and start to define them a little bit more. And it may be that I'm drawing lines where there aren't actually contours in the original, but that's the point. It's to try to find these edges so when I go in to paint it, it gets exaggerated. Alright, so here we go. He's got some really strong cheekbones, and again, this whole idea of doing multiple iterations of something is so that you can create these things quickly, and you get to know the figure. You get to know the subject pretty well if you do a bunch of these over and over again. Like there is a there's a trait where your ear lobes hang down, like Jeremy's here, or like in the case of Kiefer Sutherland, where they actually come out like that. That might be a subtlety that I would miss if I just did it once here, but I'm gonna go with what it is up here. So pay attention to the figure, pay attention to the subject, I should say, and be working with what actually exists instead of just what you think is there. Caricature is about observation and coming up with innovative solutions for the subject. So I'm just going to kind of go through and define some of these areas. You need to have a direction to the eyebrows. And the eyes are also really important because he's got some kind of squinty, he's got a real squinty stare, and so I want to make sure that I exaggerate and emphasize that as well. Something that a lot of people don't pay attention to is the hood over the eyes. It's not just about an eyelid, it's also about the eye socket and how that comes together. I can check my progress down here. Alright. Oh, and I am coloring on the underside, so lock that off. Good reason here. There we go. Alright, and I'm going to emphasize just a little more of the structure in his jaw as well, just because that's an important part of the character. Again, I'm not necessarily worried about the final here, but I just want to make sure that I get some of these markers in before I move on and start painting this guy up. You want to do a couple of different angles on this because what I mean by angles is actually finding different poses, different areas, different settings where your chosen celebrity is either in a movie or on a catwalk or whatever it is, or the red carpet, I guess. And you want to find them in these different places because you're going to find different planes in the face. And just going through and drawing the character in different settings with different planes and different angles is going to be beneficial to, again, getting to know the figure. All right. So I'm just going to create real quickly the structure of the hair. Hair has a structure, it has a shape. This one is kind of spiked off here. The more I'm looking at this, the more I'm noticing that he looks a little bit like Gordon Ramsay. So if there are some familiarities or some tendencies where I'm finding the structure to look like somebody else, I may actually pull them in for reference. I do that all the time for drawings for characters that don't. I've done some portrait work of people that are deceased, and so how do you do that? How do you handle that? Well, it actually helps to go through and find who do you think they look like that's living, and then find photographs and reference for those individuals and use that. Everything's fair game. You got to find what works for you. And we're changing so much of this that it's not. I mean, it's taken from a photograph, obviously, but we're changing so much of it that original photograph doesn't even really need to be referenced. All right, so all of a sudden we're coming up with something that's new and interesting. Jumping back and forth here. All right, throw that reference down on the bottom again. And clothing and structure, I'm exaggerating just as much as I'm exaggerating the face here. We want to make sure that everything we do uses the reference as a starting point, but it doesn't rely on it as a crutch. All right, so where we see some structure here, I'm going to exaggerate how much that flutes out there. ears are really interesting. They have a lot of different folds to them, obviously, and everybody's take on them is a little different. How you translate those folds. The overall size of the ear is gonna play into that caricature, but it's also the way things fold together that gives you some personality as well, some character trait. All right, so I'm just gonna rough in the hair here. Give some different directions to it. This is just for reference as I start to paint later on. And I really want to define where that hairline goes. And then work my way up. This is going to be more of a structural call. And refine where that is. Okay. Now, we've talked about the mouth being a very important part. You get that triangle, right? We get the eyes, the triangle right there. That area has to stay pretty intact. And then we got to go in and take a look at, does this mouth really exemplify Jeremy Renner? And I'm going to say that it doesn't at this point. I've made it a little too angular, and so I'm going to soften that a little bit. And I'm still going to use my reference underneath. This little bulge where one side of his bottom lip isn't is bigger than the other isn't as prominent as I was making it. And so this is where you're going to go back and forth between your reference and your image and see if you've really accomplished it. And even go back to the original photograph. All right, and flicking between the two can kind of give you an indication. If I go back to the photograph, maybe his bottom lip has that bulge in it. It's really, really subtle. But his top lip is really smooth across here. So I'm going to go back and kind of smooth that out. I'm still going to have a little bit of curve to it, but I'm actually going to make it a little smaller than it was in the original. I'm giving more form to it than it originally had, and that's okay. All right. All right, now this has all been real time, and so if we take a look at just the line art, that's a pretty good start. I can start to move things around and refine it. I would say as far as a likeness, I'm losing a little bit of it, so I'm going to try to hit a couple things and then come back to it, and then we'll take a look before we stop. So I'm just going to spend the next little bit of time here doing some tweaking on the likeness issues. So far this has all been real time, and so you can see that once you have your reference in place, it doesn't take that long to kind of pull out some of these markers, these visual cues that will give you some insight into creating a likeness, creating these characters, and setting things up so that later on when you're painting, you're sticking as close as you can to the source material. I think it's probably this brow here. That's one of the issues. I want these brows to really be pretty prominent. And it's okay to go away from your reference a lot. And notice that this rim light here is reflecting off of his hair. And so maybe if I go tighter into the forehead, that will go away, and it'll actually create a more effective solution there. Another thing that I'm thinking is another change in the way that the lip is working. Alright, the mouth is really important, and so I want to make sure that I'm getting it right. It may take a couple passes. And so what I'm going to do here, I just try a little bit of a different angle. Whereas this one was a little bit flat across, I'm going to give it just a little bit of a snarl or a surly look. some of this we may actually need paint to really define it. So as long as we get the markers in, the paint will actually, don't feel like you're tied down to this like it's comic book line art or something like that. It's going to become malleable and changeable once we get into the painting stage. Alright, so I think these two things in combination are working pretty well. I'm going to throw in some structural indicators for his suit, which is very, very nice, very tailored. Just a little marker for where that is. And then we're going to get into, in the next video, we're going to be actually moving into painting this thing up. And it's going to be a relatively quick approach. The painting process is the most time-consuming process. So if we get all of our reference set up and working well, it's only going to make that easier. We don't want to make that step harder. So we'll try to, as best we can, create a reference that's useful for the painting end of things. Notice there was a little blip where I was right in this area where my puppet warp kind of kinked a little bit. I'm going to smooth that over at this stage as well. Alright, and so there we go. Alright, so I'm going to back out of here. I'm going to take a look at the final product. Looks a little bit more like a prime minister of some sort, but like I said, part of it is every time you add a line in the face, it just ages the character that much more. But what we're going to do is once we get into painting, we'll be able to change some of this stuff around. So I'll just make sure that all my marks are in place. I've done everything I can to make this a reasonable likeness. And then we're going to go and soften some of these creases and things with paint after the fact. So once I get to this point, I'm going to add one more layer, and then we'll kind of call it quits on this one. There he is. One more layer, and this is going to be my shadow maps. So again, real close in on the face, and I'm not going to move this one around too much. Looks like we've got some fall off here. In some of these areas, and all I want to do is kind of define. I'm going to even go lighter with my opacity on this. I'm not really too worried about actual shading here. I just want to know where my darker spots are going to be. Again, point is not to create a likeness on the shading, but just to map in where my lights and darks are going to be so that I can start to see the volume of the piece overall. Alright, much like we were thinking about value with the greeting card sketch, the value sketch, I want to be thinking about value with this one as well, so that I know that my light source is coming from a specific area and that I'm planning ahead for it. Alright, you can spend a lot of time on this if you want, but I'm just going to kind of do some rough shadow maps to kind of define those edges and really kind of make this all work together. Alright, I'll take that off, and that gives me a little bit more dimension to it, right? And probably a core shadow right here on this big jawbone here. Alright, so between all these, I should be pretty set to move into paint next time around. There we are. Let's turn that off. I think that'll be working out pretty well. So, next time we come back, we'll be doing some actual color from this reference that we just created.